Those who do not know where they came from cannot discern the present, nor do they know where they're going in the future. It's one of the reasons why we should pay attention to history. So since our brother talked about a rabbit trail, I thought I'd do one rabbit trail to start with. So how many of you sitting here tonight know the story of the Hog Boy? Interesting. Okay. If I were to ask my people, almost nobody would know that story. But it's a story from the West Reserve. It happened in Russia, and that boy came into the West Reserve. It's a book that is published called The Forsaken Child. I did not bring a copy of it with me, but it's quite a story. Once you read that story, you'll never forget it. Okay? It's related to what I have to share with you tonight, but I doubt whether I'm even going to refer to that any further. So if you want to read the rest of the story, you're going to have to find the book. I hear there's bookstores in the area, and if they don't have it at that bookstore, it can be bought. It's still in print. The Forsaken Child. Tonight, we're talking about the Russian Mennonite migrations to North America. So last night, I talked about from Holland to Prussia. Okay? And from Prussia to Russia. We're going to talk more about that probably tomorrow night with the Golden Era. But for tonight, we're going to talk about the story of the people coming from Russia to North America. I might have been better if we had talked about the Golden Era first and then this. But one of the reasons we're doing this is the dates are tonight basically 1874 to 1880. And so it's a very important part of the story. You'll notice on this particular slide, 1/3 of the total Russian Mennonite population moved to North America. That's really significant. So why did that happen? Okay, so as I concluded last night, Catherine the Great, knowing these industrious people from her native Prussia, invited them to South Russia to develop the lands that were newly acquired from the Turks. Her inducements to Russia included the promise that the Mennonites could operate a virtual Mennonite commonwealth in Russia with complete religious freedom and exemption from military duty forever. But forever turned out to be not forever. Forever became only 100 years. The Russian government decided that Russia must become Russia, that the islands of foreign stock needed to become Russian, that days of special privilege for the German islands, the Mennonite German islands, the Lutheran German islands, and the Catholic German islands needed to end. Russian must be taught in all the schools, and military exemption must be abolished. The news came in 1871. The Mennonites had 10 years to adjust themselves to the new order. By 1881, everybody needed to be full-fledged Russian. Okay, so that's the background for the story. So I would like to look at this map here. Last night, we talked about the move from this area, the Vistula area in Poland, to the old colony, which is Kortica, down here, okay? And Malashna, a few years later, was just a little bit further southeast from them, okay? So I want you to notice that. Now, Fürstenland is the first daughter colony of Kortica. Okay, but these people, once they came down here, just mushroomed. This is just the first daughter colony. Then we have Berkthal. But we have them going to other places as well. So I pointed out last night that they went to Tract, Amtract, and also to Samara, all Samara. Okay, so the time that I'm going to be focusing on tonight, where people Russian Mennonites decided to go to North America, there's also a group of people who are moving, but they're not moving west. They're moving east into Khiva and Turkestan. And you might have heard of the story of Claus Ebb. That's that story. I'm not planning to even cover that story, but that's a story all by itself. And you can go to Turkestan and these areas today. There's a museum to those people today, even in the midst of a Muslim population. Okay? This is not even a part of what I'm going to talk about. 1909, a bunch of Mennonites moved up there. I'm not even going to talk about that. So one other thing before we go on from this. You notice right here there's a Mennonite settlement in Crimea. And to make it relevant for today, I should tell you that this whole area where the Chortitza and Malashna settlements were originally, including Crimea, are now taken by Russia from Ukraine. It's a part of the war story that's going on presently. And so once again, these areas are in the crosshairs of war. But your people are no longer there. You're out. Okay, so the Russian Mennonites came to America because the Mennonites were threatened with the loss of guaranteed government privileges. They were threatened with the loss. They were threatened with military service, compulsory military service. They were faced with the threat of Russianization, including language change, and the loss of freedoms. But the Russian Mennonites had conscience issues. They understood their faith needed to be preserved. The gospel needed to be preserved. And along with that, they had a strong sense of peoplehood so that they together needed to figure this out, what they ought to do. On top of that, by this time they were already into material wealth, and so that figured into this. Okay, I better stop right there. So let's move on. So when they found that they have to move, without wasting time, these Mennonites sent delegates to the Tsar of Russia, reminding him of the Russian promise of privilege forever. To their disadvantage, the Mennonite delegates could not speak Russian. So how are they supposed to have any kind of influence if they're trying to influence Russian leadership to favor them if they can't even speak the Russian language? They didn't realize that they were quite at a disadvantage to start with. So they failed to have an audience with the Tsar. But his officials would not promise continued military exemption. And so, drawing on their Prussian experience, like we talked about last night, a Mennonite delegate suggested the Mennonites might pay money for exemption. By this time, they have some money. With no promise forthcoming, the delegates returned home with a sense of foreboding. That was their first try. The next year, they sent another delegation. But again, they had no audience with the Tsar. And again, the delegation returned home with disappointment. And the sense of foreboding increased. The next year, 1873, several more delegations went to Petersburg in Russia for the same purpose, but again, to no avail. But the Russian government got wind of the fact that these people might move away from Russia en masse. These were so valuable. The threat of losing these people pushed the Russian government to make some concessions. And so, in 1874, there was a law passed that provided non-combatant forestry servants for Mennonites during peacetime and hospital service during wartime. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. While all these delegates are doing their work, the Mennonites began to think about emigration. You can't just wait and wake up some morning and decide to go and then know where you're going. So the question is, where should they go? Should they go to New Zealand? Should they go to Australia? Should they go to North or South America? But nobody seemed to know much about those places. Leonard Suderman, who favored immigration to North America, described the common impression his people had of North America. This is amusing. Listen, quote, "To many, America meant a country interesting to an adventurer and an asylum for convicts. How could one live in peace under his vine and fig tree amid such people? Such a life might be possible for those who had their pockets full of revolvers, but for non-resistant people it would be impossible to found homes amid such surroundings." Enter this man. This man is so important to you. There's a whole book about him called Exiled by the Czar. I consider this a very precious book. There are pictures in this book. And he is so important that I'd like to read his story to you. This man, Cornelius Jansen, was a prosperous Prussian Mennonite grain merchant. He also served as the Prussian consul at Berdiansk. Okay, so let's go back to this map. Sorry. Okay, so Berdiansk is not shown on here, but it's a town about right there where that 3 is in 1803. You notice Kortitsa is over here, and Moloshina is here, and he's at Berdiansk. Okay, he's close by. This is a harbor town on the Sea of Azov, which was right next to the Black Sea. Mennonite grain and other produce was exported to the world from Berdiansk. Because Jansen lived and worked at this export city, he had an eye for what was happening in the larger world. Also, because he understood that the Mennonites needed to emigrate from Russia, he had a lot of foresight. So he began to write letters to men in North America that he had heard about. And one of them was John F. Funk of my people, who lived near Chicago. He was actually in Elkhart, Indiana. We'll talk more about that later. In these letters, he asked John F. Funk about the military laws of the United States. What about the natural resources in North America? What about the land laws, especially in the western states? And other questions prospective settlers might have. When he got answers, he printed them and distributed the correspondence among the Russian Mennonites, your people. At the same time, he communicated with the British consul at Berdiansk about military exemption in Canada, and about the availability of large tracts of land that might be suitable places for compact settlements. Settlement en bloc, such as Canada eventually gave to your people in the East and West reserves in Manitoba. When the Canadian government authorities discovered that 50,000 industrious farmers might be interested in Canada, they took steps to direct the probable immigration to Canada. Remember I told you last night that Russian Mennonites are desirable people. If you have a chance to get them, do what it takes to get them. And when Canada heard that, they did what they could. Here's what I have to share with you, some of what they did. Canada needed farmers to take up empty western lands, lest the United States take advantage of the situation. So if you're Canadian, you know that there's something going on between Canada and the U.S. Okay, so Canada had the front edge here. And they knew that if the United States heard about this, they would get into this bidding too. And that's exactly what eventually happened. But Canada was so into this that they sent a special commissioner by the name of William Hespeler to South Russia, this is Canada, sent an emissary to South Russia to create an interest in Canada among the Russian Mennonites there. In 1872, the British consul in Birmingham wrote to the Foreign Affairs Office in London recommending the Mennonites for Canada. After William Hespeler went and searched and studied your people, your ancestors, he said, we need these people. And he's recommending you people to the Canadian government. Quote, 7 years' residence in this country has enabled me to acquire a good knowledge of them, and I am personally acquainted with many of their elders. I feel no hesitation, therefore, in saying that these Germans would prove a valuable acquisition to any country that they might select for their home. If they find difficulty in proceeding to Canada, they will seek refuge in the United States, to which country their attention has already been directed. But as I have already stated, their first choice falls on British soil. And through their determination to leave, and though their determination to leave this country is fixed, yet from what I can learn, they will do so with regret if they have to leave for any other country than Canada. In other words, Canada, we have an edge here. Let's exploit this. Do what it takes to get them. The Canadian government offered this man, William Hespeler, $2 for each Mennonite he directed to Canada. Now we got money involved. Hespeler wrote back about the offer. Quote, it would not create a very favorable effect. Neither would the agency be accepted by any of these Mennonites, as according to my experience of them, I find them more conscientious than their confessionalists in Canada or the United States. It would in their eyes look too much like dealing in human beings if we started putting prices on their heads. They are not a people like the general run of immigrants. They are reasoning, thinking, cautious, and to a large extent, an educated people. So Canada, that's not a good idea. Forget the money. But Canada really wanted these people. And so the Canadian government authorizes Hespeler to grant the Mennonites all their demands. Exemption from military service, free land. This time it's 160 acres to each head of family as part of a large compact land unit. Freedom of religion, the right to maintain the German language, control of their own schools, basically a repeat of Catherine the Great's offer of 100 years before. When the Russian government discovered what was going on beneath their noses, they told Hespeler, get out of here, leave Russia, now. In 1873, they forced this man, Cornelius Jansen, to leave as well. But Jansen, far-seeing man, had already done his homework. He had discovered that the American government was not really interested in the proposed migration, but the railroad companies were most interested. They needed buyers for their railroad land, the Santa Fe Company in particular. And so, now get this, the Santa Fe Railroad Company sent C.B. Schmidt to South Russia. This is a railroad company now, not the government. To Russia to bring as many Mennonites as possible to their railroad lands in Kansas. And so the Santa Fe instructed Schmidt, you bring these Mennonites at any cost. So we got Canada bidding on these people, we have the United States bidding on these people. So where are they going to go? Let me show you a few pictures here. That's Cornelius Jansen there. And this is him with his wife. His wife was from the Kleine-Gemeinde background, and that's her sister, her unmarried sister, sitting there. That's Cornelius sitting there at the chair. Now that's after they moved to Nebraska. Okay. I'll show you. Maybe I should. Okay, it's this man right here that the Santa Fe Railroad sent to Russia to get as many of these people as possible. And so the caption below you can't read. It says, the German-speaking immigration agent of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, Christian Crable, described Schmidt as a dapper young man who came from Dresden, Germany, and had come to Kansas at the age of 21. Colonel Ed Harum, pioneer immigration agent, said of Schmidt, in my estimation, no man in the history of Kansas has done a greater service for the state than this man when he brought the Mennonites here to live. But he didn't bring them all. So I'm getting ahead of my story. So let's go back to where we were. By 1874, emigration was the buzz talk of South Russia. That would have included your ancestors. Hespeler had suggested that the Mennonites send delegates to make a special tour of both Canada and the United States. The year before, in 1873, the Mennonites sent 12 men. Jacob Buehler of Alexanderville congregation, Leonard Suderman of Berdiansk, represented the Malashta colony, Tobias Unruh from the Bohemian settlements, Andreas Schrag, representing the Swiss settlements of the same area, Heinrich Wiebe and Oberschultz Jacob Peters from the Bergthal colony, along with Cornelius Burr, who traveled at his own expense, William Ewart from the West Prussian Mennonites, Cornelius Taves and David Clausen from the Kleinegemeinde, and brothers Paul and Lawrence Schetter from the Hutterites. These 12 men spent the summer of 1873 investigating the frontier lands of North America from Manitoba in the north, south through Minnesota, Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. They checked soil, climate, satisfactory available land, political conditions, and military regulations. I wish I had pictures of all these men. I have a picture of one of the Hutterite delegations. This man is Paul Schetter. He was one of the Hutterite delegations. He cared enough about this military thing. He was thinking in terms of kings. And so he went and asked to have an audience with the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. And believe it or not, Ulysses S. Grant gave him an audience. And he went in there and talked to him, and he couldn't believe that a President of the United States could do things like milk a cow. You know, he's not acting like a king. You saw the pictures I showed you yesterday about the Prussian officials, Frederick the Great. Well, the Russians did the same thing. They're top brass. They're way up here. But in America, Ulysses Grant was a common man. He could hardly handle that. Hardly knew what to do with that. Okay, so here's another man. This is David Gers, and that's his wife. I won't get ahead of myself. When the Russian government discovered the likelihood of losing 40,000 industrious Mennonites, they were ready to make concessions. We got to do what it takes to keep these people. Now we have 3 countries bidding on them. Canada and the United States want them, and Russia does not want to lose them. So the Russian government sent General von Todleben, himself a German Lutheran, to meet with the Mennonites. And this is what he said to them. His Majesty, Tsar Alexander, has sent me to you, and I am to tell you he loves you. And you are worthy to dwell in his empire. Why do you have in mind to emigrate? 100 years your fathers have been in this land. You enjoy it here. You have fine schools, fine churches, fine houses and gardens. You need not work yourself. The work is done without you, meaning you have Russian peasants and serfs to do your work. All you have to do is look after the work. You can hire Russian laborers at low wages. Why do you emigrate? When you come to America, you're going to have to dig trees, weed the roots, and break the prairie, and do all that work yourself. Here you have it as fine as you wish. He told them that as Russian citizens, no longer subjects of the Tsar, they could do alternate service work in the national interest by doing forestry work. He informed that in the recent American Civil War, the non-resistant people of the Confederacy had not been exempted. They didn't get what they wanted in the Civil War, so why do you think you're going to get what you want? But General von Tolben made his point. The more liberal-minded of the Mennonites decided to reconsider. And that turned out to be 2/3 of them. Why leave when concessions were forthcoming? The concessions applied to both peacetime and wartime. Interestingly, the concessions only applied to the original Mennonite settlers and their descendants. The concessions did not apply to any new immigrants to the colonies. Cortitza, the old colony, and Hofstadt leaders wrote a letter of thanks to the general and expressed their satisfaction with the concessions. They did remind him that they needed to be in complete control of the school system. But a strong minority, the more conservative-minded, was not convinced. That is your ancestors, almost the entire group of you sitting here. Your ancestors are the ones who said, I don't trust this. Some of your ancestors had already sold their properties. Entire villages continued their preparation for immigration. These people would not compromise their consciences. Two of the Cortitza daughter colonies, Bergthal and Fürstenland, decided to emigrate. Along with the almost entire congregation at Alexanderwall, the Swiss Bohemian, I talked to you about them with the map last night. They were people from Switzerland who went over further east instead of going west. These people also was a part of the story. The Hutterites and the Kleingemeinde. These are the large bodies that decided to emigrate. But from every settlement and from almost every village, individual families joined the immigration movement. In addition, many families in the German Lutheran and German Catholic neighboring colonies also decided to emigrate. On top of these numbers, some Russian Mennonites saw economic opportunity beckoning in America and emigrated for economic reasons. Remember, Russian Mennonites are expert at smelling dollars from a distance. And they saw it. And they said, okay, we can make a buck by going to America. And as I mentioned earlier, some Mennonites felt like not going west, but they wanted to go east to Turkestan. That was the answer. After all, in all the Dutch Mennonite history, the moves had always been further east. First from Holland to Prussia, then from Prussia to Russia. Why would not the next step be one more step east? Thus, while most were preparing to emigrate west, some prepared to emigrate east. And as I said, Klaus Epp. And if you want to read that story, there's a book that I do not have here. It's called The Great Trek. You can read that. As well as a most interesting book by Herman Jansen entitled Journey of Faith in a Hostile World that tell that story. When it was all said and done, 18,000 Mennonites emigrated from Russia from 1874 to 1880. 8,000 emigrated to Canada, where they had block settlement, east and west reserved. 10,000 came to the United States, mostly to Kansas, through Schmidt. Most of those who emigrated to the United States became a part of the General Conference, now MCUSA. That's a whole story itself. It's a rabbit trail I may not go down because I got to keep things moving here. So let me tell you part of the story of one of the very first groups to emigrate to the United States. This is the Krimmer group, the group that I showed you in the map that was down in the Crimean Peninsula. Okay, the Krimmer people. They were 35 families from the Crimean Peninsula. They arrived as a church body. Now think about your church as an entire unit emigrating. Well, that's the story here. So they showed up in New York on July 15, 1874, about this time of the year. Jacob Wiebe, acquainted with John F. Funk through his German paper, led his people to the Elkhart train depot early on Sunday morning, July 20, which is about this time of year. The previous night, John F. Funk, let me give you a picture of this man. Right there. He's a young man. He's a little older at the story that I'm talking about right now. This is a young man from Chicago. This is the man that these families have been communicating with. in his older years, he looked like this man right here. This is such an important figure in my story. I don't know if I'd be standing here today if it wouldn't be for this man. Okay, so that's another rabbit trail I'm not going to take. Anyway, they showed up at his door on a Sunday morning, July 20. The previous night, Funk's daughter, Grace Ann, had died. The exhausted Funk was roused from a short sleep and was told that a large group of Russian Mennonites had shown up at the train depot with their baggage and were awaiting further direction. Funk wrote, quote, "Under the circumstances, it was indeed a question as to what I could do for them. But near the church was a vacant house, quite roomy. I secured the key and opened it. After hauling the heavy baggage and the old people into the house, I called a grocer in the vicinity and asked him to open his store and sell these people bread, meat, coffee, and tea. They took the work into their own hands and washed, dressed, made dinner, and at 2 o'clock had church services. At the 2 p.m. service, Weeb preached to both immigrants and the Elkhart people. Both groups were deeply stirred and moved to tears. I would have liked to have been present that morning. Now remember, these people are speaking Plattdeutsch, and Funk is talking English. If Funk knows anything, it's High German. I don't know if this Weeb tried to preach in High German or not, but you can imagine even High German to High German, because they come from different places, it's going to be awkward. But these people could sense the spirit in each other, and it was a very moving time for them. The Krimmer group stayed in Elkhart for a month, staying temporarily in a rented house as well as in the Prairie Street church house, and later in an empty factory building. Life went on. One of their number died and was buried at Elkhart. And I could read you a story from the secret country, but we'll just leave that. So eventually they moved on to Topeka Commonwealth, which is a newspaper from Topeka, Kansas, describes the arriving strangers on September 10, 1874. Quote, "Large crowds of visitors flocked to the King's Bridge shops yesterday to see 600 Mennonites who arrived there Thursday. They were dressed in their primitive homespun garments, which were usually of coarse wool and of the most primitive style. The women and children were all consuming huge pieces of bread. They had funny old handkerchiefs tied around their heads. They had all brought huge tin pans, crockery, etc. with them, and baskets groaning under loads of bread, cheese, and sausage. The men appeared to have conscientious scruples against wearing clothes that fit them. The men's vests therefore descend towards the knee, and their pants possess an alarming amount of slack. Their favorite headgear is a flat cloth cap which they pull off and saluting any person. This habit they will soon drop now that they have arrived in Kansas, where nobody respects nothing." Okay, the cultural shock that happened, I would have loved to witness that. Let's go back here to where I was. Okay, so this picture is what it looked like in Manitoba when the immigrants got off the ship. They came upriver to I guess this is the East Reserve, and that's the ship that they were on. You can see the people standing there. And whenever they landed, there's no houses. So they stayed in an immigrant house. And that's a picture of the inside of an immigrant house. Can you imagine multitudes of families all living in the same house? They might have had some sections curtained off with sheets or something, but everybody had to live in the same place. Okay, here's another picture of Russian emigres or refugees. Now, you don't see their clothing so misshapen there. I don't know if there are any pictures of what they look like. You just have to go by your imagination. Okay, so this man, Jacob Shantz, who was in Ontario, helped these people who came to Manitoba. He is one of my kind of people who is also, in addition to John F. Funk, helping these people get started in Manitoba. This man plays a big role. He selflessly served. Okay, so I already showed you the next picture. And I showed you this picture, pointing out this is David Gores again. This is Christian Cravel, president of the Summerfelder Church. And here is Bernard Workington, he was an agent. These four men are the Western Mennonite Board of Guardians. These are the men who organized to help your ancestors find their place and to settle down. Just think about it. If they come into a new country, they don't know anything. They need help in knowing how to handle the laws and the locals, the language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the men who help them. It's very interesting to me that one of those men is one of my people. By the close of 1879, nearly 15,000 Mennonites had purchased land from the Santa Fe Railroad. A large part of the 1 million acres of the railroad land grant from the United States government. 10 years later, the Santa Fe Railroad grant land was gone. The land was growing the new turkey winter wheat brought from Russia. Okay, so let me just pause here. So this is Kansas, and this is where the railroads went in Kansas. And so I'm going to show you a picture shortly of how the railroad land grants look. But this is the trail through Kansas they went. And so some of you might recognize Newton, Kansas. That's where a lot of Russian Mennonites, they have a college there to this day. And here's Hutchinson, Kansas is about right in here. Here's Heston, Kansas. You might have heard of some of those places. And this is an unusual picture. It says this is a stone house built by Peter Funk in the spring of 1874. This was the first home erected by the 1874 immigrants. The house is still occupied and in good livable condition. It's located about 2 miles north of Canada, which I think is a town in Kansas. Okay, so this particular picture shows how it worked. So if this is the railroad right here, 1 square mile goes to the railroad. The other square mile is to the government. Everything is in alternate squares. This is the railroad right-of-way. And so the government got half the money, and the railroad got half the money. So the railroads had to have half the money because laying railroad tracks is expensive. And they were paid by selling these blocks that you see. And so this block, there are 3 blocks, there are 10 miles on each side here of checkerboard like this. White, we'll say, is government, and the colored is to the railroads. And so this picture shows that when they came, they developed theirs, where they were going to settle from the railroad, but they did not want to go onto the government because they were suspicious of government. You can't trust government. Even though they're making all these guarantees with us, we trust the railroads more than we do the government. And just like they did in Russia, they laid out a village street, and then the blocks of property all ran up against the street. It's their village plan they've had for a long time. Okay, now I'm going to change subject here a little bit. And we're going to go now to, I got one more picture to show you here, this one. This is Nebraska. This is Union Pacific lands. And so the same thing happened in Nebraska that happened in the United States. These checkerboard arrangements. Every other section of area in green is 4.85 million acres. Burlington and Missouri, every other section of brown area is 2.5 million acres. Additional state and federal grants to other railroad companies total about 820,000 acres. Okay, so let's leave that now. I'm going to change the subject here a little bit. What about the people to Canada, where some of your ancestors decided they don't want this American arrangement, they prefer Canada, where there's block settlement. And that's where the East and West reserves. And so you notice this is the East Reserve. The Kleiniger-minded people came here, and some of other people came here. The Old Colony people mostly came over here in the West Reserve. And the Hog Boy stories, people came to the West Reserve. There were two other places, but these were not nearly as big, here and here. I don't know much about either of those two areas, but this, you folks sitting here, you have roots, most likely here. It wouldn't surprise me if some of you have your roots here as well. Let me tell you some more of this. So what is that story? Those who chose Canada did for 6 reasons. Number 1, Canada promised Mennonites complete military exemption. Number 2, Canada promised the Mennonites complete control over their schools and churches. Number 3, the Mennonites preferred to be under a monarchical, in other words, a king form of government rather than a representative democracy like the United States. So they had a political reason. Number 4, the Mennonites were given a free tract of land, free now. Now think about that. If you went to Canada, you got free land. If you went to the United States, you had to pay at least some money for it. In addition to the free tract of land, the government paid $30 per person for transportation to their destination. They are really bidding high on these people. 5th, the Mennonites could retain the German language for their schools. And 6th, vast stretches of uninhabited land appealed to them. We're not talking about railroads up here. We're just talking about open stretches. These people had trees close by, but for these people, there's almost no trees. Okay? Canada wanted these people. The first Mennonites, I said, were the Kleine, who had recently planted a new colony in Russia 9 years before. They were 100 families strong. They arrived at the East Reserve in the summer of 1874. But after experiencing the cold of the following winter, 30 families decided, too cold up here, can't handle this, and so 30 families moved down to Nebraska. So they didn't stay there very long. Bergthal colony had been the first daughter colony at Kortitsa back in Russia. They planted in 1836. Now, 3,000 of these Bergthalers decided to emigrate to Canada, not the United States, but they had a problem. If most of the colony emigrated, who would be available to purchase all the Russian farms? You have to get money for your property. If they all moved, they wouldn't have any money because there would be only a few buyers. So they needed to leave Russia in 3 separate groupings. The first group consisted of 800 people. They landed in Quebec and traveled to Manitoba by train. They arrived in Winnipeg on July 31st, 1874. From there, they traveled 125 miles by steamer to their destination, the East Reserve. And I just showed you a picture of that. 2 years later, the last 500 Bergthalers had arrived. The third group to arrive in 1875 were the first land people, another daughter colony of Kortitsa, the old colony. Instead of coming to the East Reserve, these decidedly more conservative people planted their colony in the 16 townships of the unsettled West Reserve, right here. The first landers became known as old colonists. So I think most of you, if you have an old colony background, you came here, not here, most likely. They were soon joined by a group of Bergthalers who became known as Sommerfelders. And I think those people moved from here over to here. In 1874 alone, 1,275 families emigrated to the United States and Canada from the old country. Thousands of immigrants soon followed these first settlers, so that by the time emigration ceased in 1880, 10,000 Mennonites had come to the United States and 8,000 Mennonites had settled in Canada. Each of the emigrating groups had their particular stories, as did the individual families. These honest, frugal, industrious settlers created well-ordered farms, established schools, churches, hospitals, old people's homes, and a home for the mentally ill. Pause. I want you to raise your hands. How many of you have stories in your family over this time that you heard your parents, grandparents tell? Great-grandparents. Any stories passed on? Okay, 1. Is that all? 2. I'm impressed. I thought there'd be more stories. Oh, here, 3, 4. Okay. I would like to hear some of those stories. Are there books written of these stories? Or is it just oral tradition? There are books written. Okay. Well, if I was one of you and I knew that, I'd want to have one of those books. Because who we are, our identity, comes from stories like that. Back in Russia, mixed feelings lingered after the emigration. On one hand, one Mennonite said this: "Thank God that they went. It was good for them, their children, and for America. They have calmed their consciences, and America has received many good farm families to Kansas, Nebraska, Dakota, Minnesota, etc., who will make these states rich. It was also good for us and for Russia. Their stubborn piety could no longer be met with the concessions they demanded, the like of which are almost impossible to grant in a modern European nation." End of quote. And so that Russian Mennonite said, "Good, I'm glad they're gone. They'll do people in America, great. We never worked here in Russia." With the restraining influence gone, the progressives could advance forward more freely. The Mennonites had experienced a cleansing purge, and thus the golden era of the Russian Mennonites unfolded in Russia. And I'll tell that story tomorrow night. It's a whole story in itself. That's not a rabbit trail. That's a whole story. Some Russian Mennonites chided these people who left, just as the golden era was dawning. Why leave when the good times are just arriving? Now remember, Mennonites are good. They have a good smell for money. The money was just showing up. Why leave? Why choose difficulty in a foreign land when ease and plenty were at hand in Russia? But as we're going to find out tomorrow night, by 1917, the whole thing came reverse. This premature judgment reversed itself in the Mennonite political situation, turned from unparalleled freedom to the succession of tragedies, which ended with almost no Mennonites remaining in Russia today. And that is another story. It's called The Bitter End. I plan to. Tomorrow night's a golden era, and Thursday night is that story. Again, it's not a rabbit trail. It's a whole story. It's just tragedy. Okay, a few words need to be said about the Hutterites, who also came to America with the Mennonites. Russia granted them land near Malashna, and a man by the name of Johann Cornelius, who we're going to talk about tomorrow night, is very much a part of this story. He's a well-known Mennonite educator and agricultural leader who helps the Hutterites settle in a colony, not a Bruderhof, in a colony named Hutterthal. And on one of the previous maps it was listed a Hutterthal. I don't have that up here for you to see. From these two daughter colonies, from there, two daughter colonies developed. In 1859, some of the poorer families revived the old Bruderhof communal living arrangements, which they named Hutterdorf. When the Mennonites lost their privileges in the 1870s, the Hutterites decided to emigrate to America with them. Free households known as the Prairie Light, as well as the Bruderhof. All the Hutterites chose to leave Russia. They didn't leave anybody behind. And they came to America, and they all settled in the James River Valley of the Dakotas, where they prospered until World War I. And now they have an entire story, which we're not going to pursue in these meetings. Okay. Now, let me show you two pictures here, or a few more pictures. Okay, so when they showed up in Canada, you got to have houses to live in. So this is a picture of some of their houses. So the top picture is immediately. The bottom picture is 1 year later. These people don't believe in being lazy, so they worked hard at creating their settlements. But it looks rather lonely. It looks rather daunting. It makes me tired just to think about that. And of course, this is the village plan that they took from Russia and put into Manitoba. And if you've ever visited your colonies, this is what they look like. There's the main street with all the houses off to the side. And for my people, that's a strange arrangement. We just don't do it that way at all. It's fascinating for me to be here as a Swiss and to witness your culture. Well, this is very much a part of your culture, the way you settle the land. Okay, so here's another agricultural feature brought to the Canadian prairies by the Russian Mennonites. This house barn thing. I talked to you about that. It says this particular house barn is still in use in southern Manitoba. So here's a picture of some of the immigrants over that time. That might even be one of your ancestors, I don't know. And the last one for all this is the turkey red wheat. And I'm sure you know about that story, how that your people brought turkey red from Russia and it became the mainstay of Kansas in what they did there. Okay, so are there any questions that you have about this part, Canada and America, and the United States, before we move on? I want to move on to the Cornelius Jansen story in more detail. But I'll take a question or so before we go, if you have them. Okay, if not, here we go. Cornelius Jansen. I think I should go back to where he was so that you can see his picture while I'm talking. This man. He's known as the Moses of the Russian Mennonite immigration of the 1870s. He certainly qualifies for that name among the Russian Mennonite immigrants, but he also deserves recognition and respect from all Mennonites in this generation for his selfless service to his people, motivated by his personal faith in the living Christ. My hat is off to this man and what he did. And I want to share with you what he did here. He remains a timeless example to anyone involved in the large-scale work of transplanting thousands of people from one nation and culture to another. When you want to undertake a mass movement, you don't just get Farmer Henry down the road to lead the effort. This man had proved his capability and forethought and carefulness. So I can't tell you his entire story, or even half or 1/4 of it. But as I said, this book, it took this much of a book to tell his story, called Exiled by the Tsar. I found the book fascinating. Unfortunately, this book is now out of print. If you can find it online, you'll have to find it used, and I don't know what you're going to pay for it. So first of all, this man's father-in-law, Peter von Riesen of Prussia, reprinted 3,000 copies of Menno Simon's Foundation book, especially for the Kleingemeinde in Russia, but with some local sales intended as well in Prussia. Because of all the local Lutheran opposition to the content, in other words, they didn't agree with the theology here, the Prussian Mennonite church leaders threatened von Riesen with excommunication if he refused to surrender the entire printing, lest the books be distributed even in Russia. This man's father-in-law, this lady, and you see, her father is the one who printed all these things, and when he wanted to distribute them, the church leader said, "You're going to be excommunicated if you do." What was he supposed to do? Reluctantly, he surrendered them all. And they were left to the ravages of mice, moisture, and mold in the church attic for about 20 years. In summary, this man took quite a financial loss. Now think about that. This man is not about money, but about something more. Not only did he lose money, he felt his life's vision being squashed. But somehow, and I can't explain this, many of his books reached their Kleingemeinde destination in Russia, and some eventually were brought to America. I can't tell you that story even. And as I mentioned earlier, he permanently moved from Prussia to Berdiansk on the Sea of Azov to fulfill an earlier agreement with his von Riesen mother-in-law to be near her von Riesen family. And, as I said, Cornelius served as a grain broker in Berdiansk, shipping most of his red wheat to England. He preferred Russia to Prussia because Russia offered more economic and social freedom than Prussia did. At the same time, he preferred Russia over Prussia. He distrusted and disliked the Russian government, refusing to entangle himself with Russian citizenship. Even though he lived in Russia, he wouldn't become a Russian citizen. Even so, the Prussian government appointed him Prussian consul in Berdiansk for 3 years, giving him stature in the community. Now he has influence because of an office. The nearby Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin employed him for the next 9 years in the same capacity. In this capacity, the family interacted with the British consul at Berdiansk, and the children began to learn English, and so did Cornelius. The more English Cornelius learned, the more he was in demand for help and service to his English contacts. He was also in demand because he was a Mennonite and continuously served the Mennonites as a grain broker. His English, German, Russian, Mennonite connection combined perfectly to introduce reaping and threshing machinery to the Russian Mennonite colonies who were supplying grain to him. Thus, the Jansen home carried a cosmopolitan atmosphere because of the broad-reaching contacts that Cornelius worked with. Now, let me pause and interpret that a little bit. Because he was a grain broker, the more grain he could sell, the more money he could make. So he said, okay, you Russian Mennonites, you could increase production if you would cooperate with some technology. There are new inventions out there, and you ought to use them. And as they use them, they produce more grain, and he made more money. Cornelius Jansen was ready to adapt to the changing times by accepting what was new, not because it was new, but because he understood the value of the new. Along with this adaptability, he was able to adapt himself readily to new people and to new situations. This guy was anything but a stubborn guy. He just realized that he needed to flow appropriately and with good conscience to changing times. This ability to adapt qualified him for the culmination of his life work. Though Cornelius, this man, was in complete harmony with traditional Mennonite beliefs, he noted that the Mennonites could improve themselves spiritually. Not only was this man in touch with the economics and how they could even improve financially, but he says, my people are having some spiritual problems as well. He witnessed that a man by the name of Wust, who was an evangelist over in Russia, had created a revival among his people that created what we call the Mennonite Brethren. Instead of throwing everything out, Cornelius Jansen noted, something good happened there. Maybe not what we like, but something good happened. But Jansen here was not impressed with the excesses that accompanied it. That's a rabbit trail. I'm not going down that trail. You can study that out for yourself. But he did embrace the growing burden for missionary activity. Now think about that. The Russian Mennonites were not supposed to evangelize the locals, the peasants, the serfs that worked for them. But somehow, Cornelius understands this is a command from Christ. Matthew 28 is a command, just like other commands. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them and teaching them some more. Cornelius recognized that. That's a part of original Anabaptist theology. So, accordingly, he distributed Bibles and Christian literature in several languages, even providing the Hebrew scriptures to the Jews living in South Russia. Now keep that in mind for what we're going to talk about on Friday night. Or whichever day we're going to talk about the Mennonite Nazi story. He had no time for the invisible church idea, noting that it had no biblical foundation. Again, that's original Anabaptist theology. Instead, the Mennonite church had not been visible enough. He referred to his own people as we so-called Mennonites. We are non-resistant Christians called Mennonites. He said it's a mistake to say that we were founded by men of Simons. We claim to be only reformed and gathered by him and trace our history back to the Waldenses, getting nearer through them to the earliest Christian congregations of the first century. In other words, this man knew his history. Not only his theology, but he knew his history. As a moderate tobacco and alcohol user, Cornelius became convicted to become a teetotaler. Now, teetotaler means you stop using it altogether. It's not just moderate, you quit it completely. And this in the face of the Russian Mennonite community using both tobacco and alcohol. In this move, he became closer to the Kleingemeinde, his wife's people. He interceded for persecuted native Russians who broke with the Russian Orthodox Church. In the matter of dress, the wealthy Danzig Mennonites had stipulated that clothing needed to be simple in appearance, but it could be made from the finest materials. Thus, Mrs. Jansen made all her own clothes, as well as clothing for her daughters. In her view, clothing was the cover of the body, not beautify it. Now look at her dress there. She practices what she preaches. No jewelry or fashionable attire was to be worn. Quiet, subdued behavior needed to match the clothing. After the evening meal, Cornelius conducted family worship with his family. This man also loved music, and the family sang together. Cornelius played the piano and the flute, and saw to it that each of his children learned to play a musical instrument. In other words, musical instruments, they refine humans. If that's a bunny trail or rabbit trail, I cannot go. But he recognized that. The Jansen home was simple, solid, and cordial. Into this atmosphere in 1867 came English Quakers who desired to visit with the Russian Mennonite colonies. They came to him because he was the gateway. Cornelius guided them to the more progressive villages and churches, translating for them. Afterward, a Quaker leader wrote a letter to the Mennonites and stated these words, quote, "Is it not his purpose that you should be instrumental in spreading the knowledge of the truth of the gospel of Christ to those who are now sitting in darkness, sunk in ignorance and superstition? Are you prepared, dear friends, to give account of your stewardship? I do not forget the difficulties of your position or the danger which might result from attempts to enlighten your more ignorant neighbors." End of quote. Cornelius agreed with this and sent it to Odessa, a nearby town, to have it printed. Soon it came back censored, not permitted for publication. Cornelius said, quote, "This refusal to reprint such a brotherly letter awakened in me and several others real suspicion and gave the first serious thought concerning our real position under the Russian government as to how little our so-called religious liberty was worth." In other words, the government got a hold of what he wanted printed and recognized it for what it was and said, "Nope, we're not printing this." And with that, he was able to discern there's trouble coming. This experience became one of the turning points of Cornelius' life. Russia was restricting religious freedom. One of the Quaker visitors provided Cornelius with information about America. Cornelius also began reading about the Mennonites in America. The more he read, the more he began to realize that America was the future for his people. At first, he understood the matter personally, freedom for himself and his family. No contact existed between the Russian Mennonites and American Mennonites. However, some Prussian Mennonites had already emigrated to America. With these, Cornelius Jansen made contact. As I said before, America was commonly considered a country interesting for adventurers and asylum for criminals. The poor might consider moving to America, but not the wealthy Russian Mennonites. This man understood and was doing what he knew, and he was being guided by divine providence, probably in ways that he didn't even understand. And then the blow fell like lightning out of heaven. The Russian Mennonite privileges that will last forever will be ending soon. The Mennonites would need to be Russianized by 1881, as I said earlier. Military exemption would end. Cornelius began to ask questions to people who could confirm the report. Yeah, this is true. And when he confronted the governor general with a point-blank question, the report was thoroughly confirmed. He asked the right people, and they said, yep, this is going to happen, and there's no space for you. And then Cornelius Jansen's life purpose unfolded into full flower. His work would be threefold: gather information about the conditions in America, which he had already been doing, influence his Mennonite brothers in Prussia and Russia in their decision-making, get out of here, and number 3, contact the government officials in Canada and the United States. And he started doing it. Eventually, at first he worked alone, but eventually the project turned into one of the greatest Mennonite voluntary mass migrations in recent history. Now, it's important to note that his basic motive for the emigration was the reversal of the guaranteed Mennonite privileges provided to Mennonites with the opportunity to demonstrate their faith. Christians should witness to their faith whenever possible, and as widely as possible. In other words, be evangelistic. History was now offering the Mennonites that opportunity. God had deemed the Mennonites worthy to suffer for the sake of the gospel. Now think about that. Cornelius Jansen understood that the blessing of the Lord is in chastisement, not in economic opportunity. That is so impressive to me. The emigration would be an act of faith, not economic opportunity. Freedom for the church would be paramount. So he wrote, quote, "The only testimony we can give is to migrate like our fathers, and that I will do, my Lord and Savior helping me. And should I be deceived in my choice, and my children come to the same distress, my testimony will make it easier for them to go on again." In other words, he was willing to bear the responsibility of leadership. Even if his own children had problems understanding at the time, he understood what was right, and he was willing to bear the burden of their misunderstanding, knowing that eventually they would get it. I admire that. Are you aware that today some Mennonite parents and leaders are following their children? This is backwards. This man is providing leadership for his family. He says, "I did not teach them to strive after riches, but they also know well that nothing could press me to leave my good and comfortable position, except to preserve me and for them the freedom of God's children, the freedom of conscience." That's one of the most precious privileges we have, freedom of conscience. Jansen had already begun to sell his property, preparing to leave for America in the spring of 1873, when another lightning bolt fell out of heaven. On March 27, 1873, an officer in uniform, accompanied by a soldier, came up to Cornelius Jansen and gave him a letter. The letter stated that he and Wilhelm Loewens, another Prussian citizen, were spreading rumors and false ideas about Mennonite conditions in Russia and information about emigrating to America. They were to leave Russia and to never return, and they had 1 week to do so. He needed to accompany the officer to the photographer for pictures, which would be publicly posted along with other criminals, never to return. How would you like your picture plastered over Lacrete? This guy we have gotten rid of, and he's never to return. If you see him, report. Since he was not a Russian citizen, remember he had kept his Prussian citizenship. Since he was not a Russian citizen, he could not be sent to Siberia, off to the Gulag. In the end, he was given a 2-month extension of stay. But the word was out, what was going on, and his remaining property values just tumbled like that. Nobody wants to buy his property now. So, what was it like for a Russian Mennonite to encounter America? His son Peter, the oldest son, aged 21, said this. These are the things that he was impressed with when he got to America. The light spider-like buggies we saw at the various places we passed through, they seemed so frail in comparison with the ponderous vehicles in Russia and Germany. Even more striking was the absence of servants in America. Every person did his own work. He wrote, the trunks were all piled on a platform to which a dray had backed up. It was like a carriage, a little wagon. The station agent came out while I was looking for the usual baggage carriers seen on European railway stations to load the trunks. The station master looked at me a minute and said, look here, young fella, you seem pretty husky. Take hold with me and be quick about it. That was my first introduction to American independence, and it seemed very strange to me. In the first place, that an official should perform manual labor, and also he should have the temerity to command me to help him. Well, I soon got over my ideas regarding labor. When Peter and his father visited with President Grant at the White House, Cornelius Jansen also, in addition to this Hutterite, went and visited the president. The president, Ulysses Grant, told these two he could still hitch up and drive a team of horses as well as ever. The minister of agriculture told them they used to milk 20 cows by hand both morning and evening. Peter commented, you who never knew life in Europe, and especially Russia, can hardly imagine our surprise when these gentlemen gave us the impression that it was the usual thing for the highest officials of the United States and the minister of agriculture to do manual labor. Cornelius and Peter were equally surprised by the plain apparel of the government officials, the absence of uniforms with gold trimmings. In Russia, we associate a government official with a uniform with lots of gold lace and trimmings. And the higher ones would always have guards or soldiers at the entrance of their quarters and residences. Imagine our surprise when we reached the White House to find its portals guarded by a single colored man who not even displayed a sword. The two were also surprised with how Americans went to church. In a letter to Amos Herr of Lancaster County, that's my people, he wrote, in the United States and Canada, people enter the church buildings with their hats on and wear them until they sit down, sometimes keeping them on even longer. And when friends meet them, they merely nod at each other with their head. Only very seldom do they shake hands and never remove their hats. Referring to Lancaster County, here, like everywhere in America, the Mennonites have the best farms, but do very little to educate their children. A Quaker had told Cornelius, your people in this land on the average have better farms than ours, but I think we do more for the education of our children. And there's a weakness for my people. We did not do a very good job of education. These Russian Mennonites probably did a better job of educating than our people. That's another rabbit trail. We'll not go there. Of all the lands considered in America, Cornelius Jansen liked Nebraska the best. It was there that the family eventually purchased property and developed a prosperous sheep ranch. He died December 14, 1894. C.B. Schmidt, the Kansas land agent, said of Jansen, quote, was it not he who started the great emigration movement from Russia, and who, in the interest and for the welfare of his people, made the greatest sacrifices? And John F. Funk agreed, he lived not for himself. Such a selfless man. I thoroughly admire this man. Ludwig Keller of Munster, Germany, author of many books dealing with Anabaptists, says of this man, in his death, the world lost an exceptionally fine man, a man like the early Mennonites of centuries ago, yet now seldom found among them. He saw clearer than many others the far-reaching significance of the present intellectual struggles that began with the publication of my writings. He was perceptive. He understood history. And he fully realized how difficult it is in the present generation to successfully cope with them. Cornelius Jansen was an exceptional man, although not a member of the learned societies, yet he studied and followed with intense interest all the spiritual movements, and out of it built his own Christian philosophy of life. In him lived the old spirit found in members of the early Christian churches who were so severely persecuted. It is my understanding that you people sitting here, even if you've never heard of this man, you owe this man a great debt. for all he did for you. Thank you for your attention. Any final questions before we end? Okay, if not, you're welcome to chat with me after the service.